Have you ever stood at a funeral, looked at someone lying in a casket, and known with absolute certainty that they weren't actually dead? I have, and let me tell you, that moment changed everything I thought I knew about trust, family, and the lengths some people will go to hide the truth. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I stopped my sister Emma's funeral because I knew she wasn't dead. She was poisoned, and if I didn't act fast, she would actually die. I know it sounds insane, like something straight out of a thriller movie, but I promise you, every single word of what I'm about to share with you is the terrifying reality I lived through just 6 months ago. The weight of that knowledge, the absolute terror of being the only person in a room full of mourners who knew the horrible truth, it still haunts my dreams. But before I tell you about that gut-wrenching moment when I stood up and screamed for everyone to stop, when I demanded they open that casket and save my sister's life, I need to take you back to where this nightmare really began. I need you to understand the relationship Emma and I had, the love we shared, and why I was the only person who could see through the elaborate deception that nearly cost her everything. Emma and I were more than sisters. We were best friends, confidants, partners in crime since childhood. Growing up in a small town in Vermont, we only had each other to rely on. Our parents died in a car accident when I was 16 and Emma was 14, leaving us to navigate the foster care system, and eventually, when I turned 18, I became her legal guardian. Those years forged a bond between us that most siblings never experience. I knew her better than I knew myself. Every facial expression, every subtle change in her mood, every quirk and habit. We could finish each other's sentences, sense when something was wrong even from miles away. And we had this unspoken understanding that we would always protect each other no matter what. I remember the nights we'd spend in our tiny shared bedroom in the foster home, whispering our dreams and fears to each other while the sounds of our temporary family echoed through the thin walls. Emma wanted to be a photographer, to travel the world and capture moments of beauty and truth. I wanted to be a teacher, to give other kids the stability and support we'd lost when our parents died. We promised each other that no matter what happened, no matter where life took us, we'd never lose each other the way we'd lost our parents. That promise became the foundation of everything that followed. That's why when Emma met Marcus at a charity gala 3 years ago, I should have trusted my instincts. From the very first moment I met him, something felt off. He was charming, successful, said all the right things, but there was something in his eyes that didn't match his smile, a coldness that made my skin crawl. I remember that first dinner where Emma brought him to meet me, how he'd ordered for her without asking what she wanted, how he'd interrupted her stories to tell his own versions that made him sound more impressive. Little things that most people would overlook, but they added up to a portrait of a man who needed to be in control, who saw people as objects to be managed rather than individuals to be respected. Emma was completely smitten, though, and I watched as she fell head over heels for this man who seemed too perfect, too interested, too eager to sweep her off her feet and into a whirlwind romance that moved at breakneck speed. I tried to be happy for her, tried to convince myself that my concerns were just the natural protectiveness of someone who'd been her guardian for so long. Maybe I was jealous, I told myself. Maybe I was having trouble adjusting to the fact that Emma didn't need me to take care of her anymore. They were engaged within 6 months, married within a year, and suddenly my sister, my Emma, who used to tell me everything, who valued her independence and always put her career first, became someone I barely recognized. She started canceling our weekly coffee dates, making excuses when I called, and when we did manage to spend time together, Marcus was always there, hovering, controlling the conversation, answering questions she should have answered herself. I watched as Emma's vibrant wardrobe of colorful dresses and bold patterns slowly transformed into the muted grays and beiges that Marcus preferred. I noticed how she stopped sharing her photography on social media, how her camera, the expensive professional one she'd saved for years to buy, started gathering dust on a shelf. When I asked her about it, she gave me this sad little smile and said Marcus thought photography was more of a hobby than a real career, that she should focus on supporting his law practice and maybe starting a family soon. The words sounded like they came from Marcus's mouth, not hers, and it broke my heart to see my fierce, independent sister shrinking herself to fit into someone else's vision of who she should be. I tried to talk to her about it, tried to express my concerns, but she would just smile that sad, resigned smile and tell me I was being overprotective, that I needed to let her live her own life. And maybe she was right. Maybe I was just having trouble letting go, adjusting to the fact that I wasn't the most important person in her life anymore. So I backed off, gave them space, tried to be happy for her even as this gnawing feeling in my gut told me something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. I threw myself into my teaching job, spending long hours preparing lessons and grading papers, anything to avoid thinking about how I was losing my sister to a man I didn't trust. But I couldn't shake the feeling, couldn't stop the worry that crept into my thoughts during quiet moments. I'd lie awake at night, remembering our promise to always protect each other, wondering if backing off was actually breaking that promise. Then, about 8 months ago, Emma started getting sick. It began with what seemed like a simple stomach bug: nausea, vomiting, fatigue that she couldn't shake no matter how much she rested. When she called me from the bathroom floor of her house, too weak to stand, her voice shaking with fear and confusion, something inside me knew this wasn't just a virus. I rushed over immediately, found her pale and trembling, her skin clammy with sweat, and insisted on taking her to the emergency room despite Marcus's protests that she just needed rest. The doctors ran tests, found nothing conclusive, prescribed medication for gastritis that didn't help at all. They sent her home with instructions to stay hydrated and rest, completely missing what was really happening. Week after week, I watched my vibrant, energetic sister deteriorate before my eyes. Her skin took on this grayish pallor that reminded me of old newspapers. Her hair started falling out in clumps that would clog the shower drain, and she lost so much weight that her clothes hung off her frame like they were draped over a hanger. Her hands developed a tremor that made it impossible for her to hold her camera steady, and she developed these strange dark lines on her fingernails that the doctors dismissed as a vitamin deficiency. But here's what really terrified me. The symptoms would come and go in cycles. She'd have a terrible week where she could barely get out of bed, where even the smell of food would send her running to the bathroom, where the fatigue was so profound she'd sleep 16 hours a day and still wake up exhausted. And then suddenly she'd seem almost normal again, almost like her old self, with energy and appetite and color in her cheeks. I started keeping a journal, documenting every conversation we had, every symptom she described, noting the dates and circumstances of her good days and bad days. I'm naturally organized, it's the teacher in me, and I started creating charts and timelines, looking for patterns in what seemed like random fluctuations in her health. And that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Emma would feel better when Marcus traveled for work, and she'd get worse shortly after he returned home. It was consistent, predictable, like clockwork. Marcus would leave for a business trip on Monday, and by Wednesday, Emma would be feeling better, texting me about maybe meeting for lunch, talking about picking up her camera again. Then Marcus would come home Friday night, and by Sunday she'd be sick again, canceling our plans and apologizing weekly over the phone, while I could hear Marcus in the background asking who she was talking to. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, letting my dislike of Marcus cloud my judgment and turn innocent coincidences into sinister patterns. I actually made an appointment with a therapist, thinking maybe I needed help dealing with my control issues and my inability to let Emma go. But during that session, when I laid out the timeline and the pattern I'd noticed, the therapist didn't dismiss my concerns the way I'd expected. Instead, she asked me if I'd considered that my instincts might be trying to tell me something important, that sometimes our unconscious minds pick up on patterns our conscious minds want to dismiss. I couldn't shake the feeling, couldn't ignore the way my instincts screamed at me every time I saw them together, every time he'd bring her a cup of tea with this particular look on his face, satisfaction mixed with something else I couldn't quite identify. I started researching obsessively, spending hours late at night reading medical journals, true crime cases, articles about poisoning symptoms and domestic abuse patterns. I learned about arsenic poisoning, about how Victorian-era murderers would use it because the symptoms mimicked common illnesses. I read about modern cases where spouses had slowly poisoned their partners for insurance money or to be free to pursue affairs. What I discovered terrified me because Emma's symptoms matched arsenic poisoning almost perfectly. The cyclical nature, the gastrointestinal distress, the hair loss, the fatigue, the fingernail changes, even the way her symptoms would temporarily improve when she wasn't exposed to the toxin. It all fit like pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking into place. I knew I had to do something, had to find proof before it was too late, but I also knew that if I accused Marcus without evidence, I'd lose Emma forever. She was so dependent on him by this point, so isolated from her old friends and even from me, that she'd never believe me over him. He'd positioned himself as her sole caretaker, the only one who truly understood her illness, the devoted husband standing by his sick wife while everyone else had drifted away. If I came to her with nothing but suspicions and theories, he'd paint me as the jealous sister who'd never accepted their marriage, who was trying to destroy her happiness out of spite. So I did something that still makes me feel guilty, something that went against every principle I'd taught my students about respecting boundaries and privacy. I broke into their house one afternoon when I knew they'd both be out. I'd called Marcus's office and confirmed he had court all day, and I'd suggested to Emma that she come stay with me for the afternoon since she'd been feeling a bit better. She'd agreed, grateful for the company and the change of scenery, and I'd spent 2 hours with her, making sure she was comfortable and distracted, before pretending I needed to run a quick errand. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the lockpick I'd bought online and learned to use through YouTube videos, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst right out of my chest. I felt like a criminal, like I was violating Emma's trust and privacy, but I kept reminding myself that I was trying to save her life. I had maybe an hour before they'd be home, 60 precious minutes to find something, anything that would prove what Marcus was doing to my sister. I tore through the house like a woman possessed, searching drawers, cabinets, closets, looking for I didn't even know what. I started in the kitchen, checking every canister and container, looking for anything that seemed out of place. Then I moved to the bathroom, searching through medications and supplements, photographing every label so I could research them later. I went through Marcus's dresser, his nightstand, the garage, becoming increasingly desperate as time ticked away and I found nothing. And then, tucked away in the back of Marcus's home office, hidden behind a row of law books in a locked drawer that I managed to jimmy open with a letter opener, I found it. A small glass vial filled with white powder, labeled in Marcus's precise handwriting with chemical formulas I didn't recognize but knew I could look up later. Beneath it was a ledger, the kind of leather-bound notebook you might use for journaling, but filled with Marcus's meticulous notes instead of personal reflections. My hands trembled as I photographed every page of that ledger with my phone, barely able to believe what I was seeing, having to stop and wipe tears from my eyes so the camera would focus properly. Marcus had been meticulously documenting everything: doses measured in milligrams, times of administration, Emma's reactions recorded with clinical detachment, adjustments to his method based on her symptoms and the attention from doctors. It was all there in his neat, precise handwriting, a roadmap of murder laid out in clinical detail as if he were documenting a scientific experiment rather than the systematic destruction of another human being. He'd been poisoning her slowly, carefully, for months, and according to his notes, he was planning to increase the dosage soon, noting that her body had built up some tolerance and he needed to accelerate the timeline. There were calculations of her body weight, notes about insurance policies and their payout terms, even a tentative timeline for the funeral and his plans for afterward. He'd written about how he needed to maintain the appearance of the devoted husband, how he needed to ensure the doctors didn't discover the poison until after Emma was dead and cremated. The cold, calculating nature of it, the complete absence of any remorse or recognition that he was destroying a person he'd promised to love and cherish. It made me want to vomit right there in his office. I wanted to scream, wanted to grab Emma and run as far away as we could possibly go, wanted to burn that house down with all of Marcus's carefully laid plans inside it. But I forced myself to think clearly, to be smart about this, because I knew that if I made the wrong move, Marcus would find a way to escape justice and finish what he'd started. I couldn't just take the evidence. He'd know someone had been in the house, and he might destroy everything else or worse, accelerate his timeline and kill Emma before I could stop him. So I photographed everything, every single page, making sure the images were clear and readable, checking twice that they'd saved properly to my phone and automatically backed up to my cloud storage. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, down to the angle of the vial and the position of the ledger in the drawer. I locked the drawer again, repositioned the books to hide it, and got out of there with minutes to spare, my heart racing the entire drive back to my apartment where Emma was waiting, wondering what had taken me so long. I went straight to the police with my evidence, walked into the station with my phone full of incriminating photos and my journal documenting Emma's symptoms, absolutely convinced they'd arrest Marcus immediately, and this nightmare would be over. I showed them everything to Detective Morrison, a tired-looking man in his 50s, who barely glanced at my evidence before leaning back in his chair with the weary expression of someone who'd heard too many conspiracy theories from concerned family members. He listened to my explanation, looked through the photos on my phone with the kind of perfunctory attention that told me he wasn't really taking it seriously, and then delivered the news that shattered my hopes. What I had wasn't enough, he told me. The photos could be photoshopped. People did it all the time to frame spouses in custody battles. The ledger could be dismissed as creative writing or notes for a novel or a twisted fantasy that Marcus never actually acted on. Without a toxicology report showing actual poison in Emma's system, without Emma herself making an accusation, there was nothing they could do. He suggested I talk to Emma, convince her to get tested, convince her to press charges if the tests came back positive. but he made it clear that without her cooperation or, and I quote, a body with poison in it, his hands were tied by the law. A body with poison in it. Those words echoed in my mind as I left the station, defeated and terrified, realizing that the system I'd trusted to protect people was actually designed in a way that would let Marcus continue poisoning Emma until it was too late to save her. I tried calling Emma immediately, my fingers fumbling with my phone as I sat in my car in the police station parking lot, but Marcus answered her phone. His voice was smooth, pleasant, concerned as he asked if everything was all right, as he told me that Emma was resting and couldn't be disturbed because she'd had a particularly bad day and finally managed to fall asleep. I could hear the threat underlying his polite words, could feel his awareness that I was getting too close to the truth, that I was becoming a problem he'd need to deal with. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him I knew what he was doing and he wouldn't get away with it, but I forced myself to stay calm, to play along, to pretend I was just a concerned sister checking in. Because if Marcus knew I'd found the evidence, if he suspected I'd been in his house and seen his ledger, Emma's life would be measured in hours instead of weeks. That night, I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, could barely function as I tried to figure out my next move. I considered breaking into their house again and just taking Emma by force, but I knew Marcus would call the police and I'd be the one arrested for kidnapping. I thought about trying to slip Emma a note during one of our visits, warning her about Marcus, but I knew he monitored everything. Her phone, her emails, probably even her conversations when he wasn't in the room. I was trapped in this horrible situation where I had the truth and the evidence but no legal way to act on it, watching the clock tick down toward Emma's death and feeling utterly powerless to stop it. I paced my apartment until 3 a.m, going over every possible scenario, trying to find some way to save my sister that wouldn't make things worse. And then, at 3:17 a.m, according to the timestamp on my phone, Marcus called me. His voice was choked with what sounded like genuine grief, breaking on the words as he told me Emma had died in her sleep, that he'd woken up to find her cold and lifeless beside him, that the paramedics were there but there was nothing they could do, that I needed to come right away. I don't remember driving to their house, don't remember the 20-minute journey that must have taken me there, but suddenly I was standing in their bedroom, staring at my sister's body on the bed, surrounded by paramedics who were packing up their equipment with the resigned efficiency of people who'd seen death too many times. Emma looked peaceful, almost like she was sleeping, her hair spread across the pillow and her face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months. But there was an unnatural stillness about her, a complete absence of the subtle movements that define life, the rise and fall of breath, the flutter of eyelids during dreams, the slight shifts of position that even deeply sleeping people make. Her skin had taken on a waxy quality that made her look more like a sculpture than a person, and her hands, folded across her chest, were already cooling, the warmth leaching out of her into the sheets beneath. Marcus was sitting in the corner, his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs that felt performative, even in my state of shock. He looked up when I entered, and for just a fraction of a second before the grief mask slammed back into place, I saw something else in his eyes. Satisfaction, triumph, the look of a chess player who'd just won the game. The paramedics explained that it looked like her heart had simply given out, that given her recent health issues it wasn't entirely unexpected, and that the medical examiner would perform an autopsy to determine the exact cause of death. An autopsy. The word cut through my fog of grief like a knife. If they performed an autopsy, they'd find the poison, they'd know Marcus murdered her, they'd have the evidence Detective Morrison said they needed. Hope flared in my chest for the first time in hours. The thought that maybe justice would happen after all, that maybe Emma's death wouldn't be completely in vain if it meant Marcus would finally face consequences. But Marcus was already talking to the head paramedic, his voice steady despite the tears still wet on his cheeks, explaining that for religious reasons, Emma had wanted to be buried quickly without an autopsy, that it was against their beliefs. He pulled out a document supposedly signed by Emma, requesting no autopsy and immediate burial in accordance with religious traditions. I wanted to scream that it was a lie, that Emma wasn't religious, that we'd grown up without any particular faith and she'd never expressed any interest in religious burial practices. But the words stuck in my throat as I stared at what appeared to be my sister's signature at the bottom of the page, the familiar loops and curves of her handwriting authorizing her own cover-up. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, phone calls to distant relatives who hadn't seen Emma in years, and my desperate attempts to find some way to stop what was happening. I contacted the medical examiner's office, but they told me that with the signed document and no evidence of foul play visible to the paramedics, they wouldn't perform an autopsy against the family's wishes. I begged, pleaded, told them about my suspicions and the evidence I'd found, But the assistant I spoke to said I'd need to file a police report and get a court order, which could take weeks. Weeks we didn't have because Marcus was moving forward with the funeral at record speed. I went back to Detective Morrison, showed him my evidence again, told him about Emma's death and the suspicious document, but he maintained that without proof the signature was forged or proof that a crime had been committed, he couldn't intervene in funeral arrangements. The law, he explained with what seemed like genuine sympathy, was designed to respect the wishes of the deceased and their immediate family, and as Emma's husband Marcus was her immediate family in a way that trumped my rights as her sister. Marcus moved quickly, leveraging his connections and money to expedite every part of the funeral process. He scheduled the service for just 3 days after Emma's death, claiming she would have wanted a small, intimate ceremony without delay. I watched helplessly as he orchestrated everything, playing the role of grieving widower with an Oscar-worthy performance that had everyone rushing to comfort him while I stood alone in my grief and fury, isolated by my knowledge of the truth. People kept telling me how lucky Emma had been to have such a devoted husband, how Marcus was being so strong through this tragedy, how I should be grateful that Emma had known such love before she passed. Each word felt like another shovel full of dirt being thrown on my sister's grave, burying the truth along with her body. I tried to talk to Emma's old friends, to anyone who might help me or believe me, but Marcus had already gotten to them, painting me as the sister who'd never accepted their marriage, who was so consumed by grief that I was making wild accusations and seeing conspiracies where there were none. By the time the funeral arrived, I was completely isolated, branded as the unstable sister who needed professional help to deal with her denial. The morning of the funeral, I woke up with this absolute certainty that I couldn't let this happen. Couldn't let Marcus get away with murdering my sister and burying the evidence 6 feet underground where no one would ever find it. The clarity was sudden and complete, cutting through the fog of grief and fear that had paralyzed me since Emma's death. I got dressed in the black dress I'd bought for the funeral, my hands steady for the first time in days, my mind crystal clear about what needed to happen. I knew what I had to do, even if it meant everyone would think I'd lost my mind, even if it meant destroying my own reputation and relationships, even if it meant standing alone against a room full of people who thought I was crazy. None of that mattered. All that mattered was the truth, and giving Emma a chance at justice, or at the very least, ensuring that her real cause of death came to light. I rehearsed what I would say, how I would present my evidence, how I would make people listen even when they wanted to dismiss me. I packed my phone with the photos, printed out some of the most damning pages from Marcus's ledger, and prepared myself for what I knew would be the most difficult moment of my life. The funeral home was packed with people when I arrived, all of them dressed in somber black, whispering in hushed, respectful tones about how tragic it was, how young Emma had been, how devoted Marcus was to give her such a beautiful service. I recognized some of them, Emma's colleagues from before she'd quit her job, neighbors from their street, Marcus's professional associates who'd probably never exchanged more than pleasantries with Emma. The absence of people who'd really known her, who'd loved her for who she truly was, struck me as I walked through the crowd. I signed the guest book with trembling fingers, accepted condolences from people who barely knew my sister, and made my way to the front of the room where the casket sat, closed per Marcus's request because Emma wouldn't want people to see her like that. Flowers surrounded it, elaborate arrangements that must have cost thousands of dollars, Marcus's way of performing grief through expensive displays. I stood there, staring at that polished wooden box, knowing my sister was inside, knowing she wasn't actually dead yet, knowing I was running out of time. You see, during my research into poisoning, I'd learned something crucial that most people don't know. Arsenic poisoning can create a death-like state where breathing and pulse become so shallow they're nearly undetectable. Victims can appear dead for hours or even days before either truly dying or, in rare cases, recovering if the poison is purged from their system and they receive proper medical treatment. The thought that Emma might be trapped in her own body, unable to move or speak or signal that she was still alive, paralyzed but conscious and aware as they prepared to bury her alive, it was too horrifying to contemplate, too nightmare-inducing to allow myself to think about for more than a second without breaking down completely. I'd tried to explain this to the funeral director, to the medical examiner, to anyone who would listen, but they all looked at me with pity, assuming grief had driven me to denial and desperate fantasies. The funeral director had been particularly condescending, patting my hand and assuring me that the paramedics were professionals who knew how to determine death, that my sister was at peace now, and I needed to accept that and begin the healing process. But I knew what I knew, had done the research, understood the science of how arsenic affects the body and nervous system. I knew it was possible, however unlikely, that Emma was still alive in there, fighting against the poison's effects, waiting for someone to realize the truth and save her. The service began, and I sat in the front row, barely hearing the minister's words as he talked about Emma's kindness, her love of life, her tragic early death. He didn't know her, had probably never met her before Marcus hired him for the service, and his generic platitudes about heaven and peace and God's plan rang hollow in my ears. Marcus sat beside me, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand in a gesture that probably looked comforting to everyone else, but felt like a threat to me, like he was reminding me that he'd won, that Emma was gone, and there was nothing I could do about it. He leaned close at one point and whispered, "I know this is hard, Sarah, but Emma wouldn't want you to make a scene. She'd want you to let her rest in peace." The implied warning was clear. He knew I suspected something, knew I'd been to the police, and he was daring me to act on it, confident that no one would believe me and that any disruption would only cement my reputation as the unhinged sister who couldn't accept reality. People stood up one by one to share memories of Emma, and I listened to them talk about a version of my sister that barely resembled the woman I knew, their stories sanitized and generic, revealing how little they'd actually known her. They talked about her smile, her kindness, her beauty, but none of them mentioned her passion for photography, her wicked sense of humor, her fierce independence that Marcus had systematically crushed. They were eulogizing a stranger, a two-dimensional character that Marcus had constructed to replace the real Emma. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the podium on shaking legs, looked out at the sea of faces staring at me with sympathy and expectation, and opened my mouth to deliver the eulogy I'd prepared, the safe, acceptable speech about loving my sister and missing her, and cherishing our memories together. But the words that came out were nothing like what I'd written. Instead, I heard myself saying, my voice clear and strong, "Emma isn't dead." The room went completely silent, the kind of silence that's so profound you can hear your own heartbeat thundering in your ears, hear the rustle of clothes as people shift uncomfortably, hear the soft hum of the air conditioning that had been invisible beneath the murmur of conversation. Every eye in the room fixed on me, some with concern, some with shock, some with the dawning horror of people who think they're witnessing a mental breakdown in real time. "She's been poisoned," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word, fed by months of suppressed truth and desperate conviction. "She's not dead. She's in a coma-like state caused by chronic arsenic poisoning, and if we bury her now, we'll be burying her alive." The reaction was immediate and chaotic. People started murmuring, the sound building from whispers to outright conversation, some standing up in shock, others looking at me with horror and pity, still others glancing at Marcus to see how he'd respond to his sister-in-law's apparent breakdown. Marcus jumped to his feet, his face a perfect mask of wounded grief mixed with concern, and said in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, "Sarah, please, I know you're hurting, but this isn't—" I cut him off, my voice ringing through the funeral home with an authority I didn't know I possessed. Years of classroom management and dealing with difficult students suddenly paying off in this most unexpected way. "I have proof," I said, pulling out my phone and holding it up for everyone to see. "I have photographs of the poison Marcus has been using, of the ledger where he documented every dose, every symptom, every step of his plan to murder my sister slowly enough that no one would suspect." I started walking toward the casket, and several people moved to stop me, hands reaching out to restrain the crazy woman who was disrupting this solemn occasion, but I pushed past them with a strength born of pure desperation and determination. "We need to open this casket right now and check for signs of life. We need to call an ambulance and get her to a hospital before it's too late." My voice broke on those last words, emotion overwhelming the careful control I'd maintained, because I knew how crazy I sounded, knew how this looked to everyone watching, but I also knew it was Emma's only chance. Marcus was shouting now, telling everyone I'd clearly had a breakdown, that grief had made me delusional, that security needed to escort me out immediately before I traumatized everyone further with my wild accusations and desperate fantasies. The funeral director was trying to restore order, his professional calm cracking as he asked everyone to please calm down, to give the family space to deal with this difficult situation. But I was already at the casket, my hands on the lid, trying to figure out how to open it, my fingers scrabbling at the seal while Marcus tried to physically pull me away, his grip on my arm tight enough to bruise. And then, in that moment of absolute chaos with dozens of people shouting and Marcus trying to drag me away from the casket, I felt it, the faintest vibration against the wood, so subtle I almost missed it beneath the noise and confusion. It came again, stronger this time, a tiny thump from inside the casket that sent electricity shooting through my veins. I screamed, loud enough to cut through every other sound in the room. "She's moving! She's alive in there! Someone help me open this!" I don't know if people actually believed me or if the sheer intensity of my conviction, the absolute certainty in my voice, was enough to make them doubt their assumptions and give me the benefit of the doubt. But suddenly hands were helping me instead of restraining me, and together we managed to get the casket open, the seal breaking with a hiss that sounded like a gasp in the silent room. There she was, my sister Emma, lying perfectly still in a white dress, her hands folded across her chest, looking for all the world like a peaceful corpse ready for eternal rest. For a horrible moment that stretched into infinity, I thought I'd been wrong. Thought grief and desperation had driven me to this humiliating, unforgivable disruption of her funeral. That I'd see that tiny movement played on loop in my nightmares for the rest of my life. The doubt crashed over me like a wave, threatening to drag me under, and I could feel everyone's eyes on me, could sense their pity and judgment, could hear Marcus already starting to say something about getting me help. But then I saw it. Her eyelid flickered, just the tiniest movement, barely perceptible unless you were looking for it, watching with the intensity of someone whose entire world depended on seeing that one small sign of life. "She's alive!" I screamed, my hands going to her neck to search for a pulse, my fingers pressing against her cold skin, searching desperately for any sign of circulation. It was there, so faint I could barely feel it, even when I knew where to look. A thread-thin flutter that was the only thing standing between my sister and death. "Call 911 right now! She needs immediate medical attention!" The room erupted into complete pandemonium. Someone was screaming that this was impossible, that the paramedics had already pronounced her dead. Someone else was already on the phone with emergency services, explaining in a shaking voice that they had a woman in a casket who might still be alive. And through it all, I kept my fingers pressed to Emma's neck, monitoring that thread-thin pulse that seemed to grow slightly stronger now that she was exposed to fresh air and light, now that whatever death-like state the poison had induced was beginning to lift. The paramedics arrived within minutes, possibly some of the same ones who'd pronounced Emma dead 2 days earlier, and I'll never forget the look on their faces when they confirmed what I'd been saying. The shock and disbelief and professional concern as they realized they'd made a catastrophic error. Emma was alive, barely, clinging to life by the thinnest of margins, her vital signs so depressed they'd been missed during the initial examination. They worked on her right there in the funeral home, starting an IV, checking her vitals with equipment more sophisticated than what they'd had at the house, asking rapid-fire questions about what she might have been exposed to. I told them everything. About my suspicions, about the arsenic, about the ledger I'd found and photographed, about how Marcus had been systematically poisoning her for months. One of the paramedics, a young woman whose name tag read Rodriguez, immediately called for a specialized team and specific medications to counteract arsenic poisoning, her training kicking in as she processed the information and began treatment protocol. I watched as they loaded my sister onto a stretcher and rushed her to the ambulance, watched as they worked to stabilize her enough for transport, and I tried to follow, needed to be with her. But the police had arrived by then, drawn by the chaos and the emergency call, and they had questions, lots of questions. Detective Morrison was there, the same detective who dismissed my concerns days earlier, and the look on his face when he saw Emma being loaded into the ambulance was a mixture of shock and guilt that would have been satisfying if I'd had any emotional energy left to feel satisfaction. I showed them the photos on my phone, told them where to find the physical evidence in Marcus's office, explained everything I'd discovered over the past few months in a rush of words that tumbled over each other in my haste to make them understand, to make them act before Marcus could destroy evidence or flee. And Marcus, who'd been shouting his innocence and my insanity just minutes before, made the fatal mistake of trying to run. He'd been edging toward the exit during the chaos, probably thinking everyone was too distracted to notice, but security caught him before he made it out of the funeral home. I watched as they tackled him to the ground, heard the thud of his body hitting the floor and his grunt of pain, and saw the look on his face when they pulled his arms behind his back to cuff him. It wasn't grief or innocence or even fear. It was pure, undiluted rage at having his perfect plan thwarted so close to completion, at being outsmarted by the sister he'd dismissed as an annoyance, at losing the game he'd thought he'd won. The next few hours were a blur of police stations and statements and desperate phone calls to the hospital for updates on Emma's condition, each minute feeling like an hour as I waited to hear if my desperate gamble had saved her or if I'd simply delayed the inevitable. The toxicology tests came back positive for massive amounts of arsenic in her system, confirming everything I'd suspected, validating months of dismissed concerns and ignored warnings. The police executed a search warrant on Marcus's house and found not just the vial and ledger I'd photographed, but a whole cache of evidence he'd been too arrogant to properly hide. Receipts for arsenic purchases made through various online accounts, a second ledger detailing his financial motivations, including a life insurance policy worth $2 million that Marcus would have inherited, and even recordings he'd made documenting the poisoning. According to the detective who interviewed me later, Marcus had apparently been recording himself administering the poison and describing Emma's reactions, creating what amounted to audio documentation of murder, possibly as some kind of sick trophy, or possibly because he genuinely thought he'd never be caught and wanted a record of his perfect crime. The detective who'd initially dismissed my concerns called to apologize, his voice heavy with guilt, as he explained that they get so many paranoid family members making accusations that he'd assumed I was another one, that he should have looked more closely at my evidence, that he was sorry. But I barely heard him, couldn't process apologies or vindication or anything beyond the desperate need to get to the hospital, to be with Emma, to know if she was going to survive. When I finally made it to the ICU after giving my statement and being told I was free to go, the doctors told me the next 72 hours would be critical. The arsenic had done massive damage to her organs, particularly her liver and kidneys. And even with aggressive treatment, including chelation therapy to remove the poison from her system, there was no guarantee she'd survive. They explained that the death-like state had actually protected her in some ways, slowing her metabolism and the poison's effects, but that she'd been incredibly close to true death when we'd opened that casket. Another few hours, they said, and it would have been too late. I set up camp in the waiting room, refusing to leave, living on vending machine coffee and the occasional sandwich forced on me by nurses who took pity on the woman who'd saved her sister from being buried alive. I called my school and told them I needed emergency leave, called Emma's old friends and told them what had happened, watched as news of the story spread through our small community, and then beyond as media outlets picked up the sensational tale. But all of that felt distant and unimportant compared to the question of whether Emma would wake up, whether she'd recover, whether my desperate action at the funeral had been enough. On the second day, Emma's vitals started to improve, the numbers on the monitors climbing slowly but steadily as the treatment worked, and her body began to purge the poison. On the third day, she opened her eyes, confused and disoriented but alive, so beautifully, wonderfully alive that I burst into tears the moment I saw her looking at me. I was there when she woke up, holding her hand, and the first words out of her mouth were my name, spoken in a voice rusty from disuse but unmistakably hers. She couldn't remember much about the poisoning or the funeral. The doctor said that was normal, that her brain had been protecting itself from the trauma, but she knew Marcus had done something terrible, could feel the truth of it in her bones even if the specific memories were hazy. Over the following weeks, as Emma slowly recovered and I stayed by her side almost constantly, pieces of the story came together from her fragmented memories and Marcus's evidence. Marcus had started poisoning her almost immediately after their wedding, motivated by a combination of debt he'd hidden from her and greed and what the psychologist who evaluated him later described as narcissistic personality disorder with psychopathic tendencies. He'd married Emma not for love, but because he'd seen her as an easy target, young, orphaned, with a decent life insurance policy through her job and no close family except a sister he'd successfully isolated her from. The arsenic came from an industrial contact he had through his law practice, and he'd been meticulous in his planning, researching everything from dosage to timing to how to fake grief convincingly enough that no one would suspect. His only mistake had been underestimating the bond between Emma and me, underestimating my willingness to look crazy and destroy my own reputation, and stand alone against everyone to save my sister's life. The legal process was long and painful, dredging up every horrible detail of what Marcus had done, putting Emma through the trauma of testifying despite her incomplete memories and ongoing recovery. She had to sit in a courtroom and describe the confusion she'd felt when she got sick, how Marcus had been so caring and attentive, bringing her special teas that she now understood had been laced with poison, holding her hand through doctor's appointments while secretly ensuring those doctors never found the real cause of her illness. She talked about the dreams she'd had during the death-like state, how she'd felt trapped and aware but unable to move or communicate, how she'd heard voices around her, including Marcus's, how she'd felt herself being moved and positioned and dressed but couldn't respond. The prosecutor presented my evidence, the photos, the ledgers, the recordings, the toxicology reports, along with the medical testimony about the arsenic found in Emma's system and the death-like state it had induced. Marcus's defense tried to paint me as an obsessed, jealous sister who'd manufactured evidence because I couldn't accept Emma's marriage. But the physical proof was irrefutable, backed up by experts and Emma's own testimony and the documentation Marcus himself had created. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on charges of attempted murder, fraud, and a host of other crimes that would ensure Marcus spent the rest of his life in prison. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison with no possibility of parole, and as they led him away in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit that replaced his expensive suits, he looked at me with such hatred that I actually felt sorry for him. Not because he didn't deserve his punishment, but because I couldn't imagine living with that much darkness inside. Couldn't understand how someone becomes so broken that they can watch another person suffer and feel nothing but satisfaction. Emma's physical recovery took months of intensive treatment to repair the organ damage the arsenic had caused, months of physical therapy to rebuild strength and muscles that had atrophied, months of follow-up appointments and tests to ensure the poison was completely gone from her system. But her emotional recovery took even longer, requiring therapy and support groups and patient rebuilding of her ability to trust. She had nightmares about being trapped in the casket, unable to move or scream, aware of everything happening around her, but powerless to signal that she was still alive, feeling the casket close and knowing they were going to bury her, and she'd suffocate in the dark. She struggled with guilt over not seeing Marcus's true nature sooner, over not believing me when I first tried to warn her about him, over all the signs she'd missed or rationalized away. We went through therapy together, both individual sessions and joint sessions as sisters, working through the trauma and rebuilding our relationship on an even stronger foundation than before. I learned to forgive myself for the times I doubted my instincts, for the moments when I'd almost convinced myself I was being paranoid or overprotective, for not acting sooner or more decisively. Emma learned that the abuse and manipulation she'd experienced weren't her fault, that Marcus had been a skilled predator who deliberately exploited her vulnerabilities, including her grief over our parents and her desire for family and stability. Together, we learned that survival isn't just about making it through the immediate crisis. It's about choosing every single day to heal, to grow, to not let the darkness of what happened define the rest of our lives or destroy our capacity for trust and love. Now, 6 months later, Emma is healthier than she's been in years, physically and emotionally. She's back to work as a freelance photographer, building the career Marcus tried to take from her. And her photos are better than ever, deeper, more emotionally resonant, informed by her understanding of fragility and survival. She's rebuilt her friendships, reconnected with people Marcus had driven away, and most importantly, she's reclaimed the fierce independence and joy for life that he tried to steal from her. We see each other almost every day, never taking for granted the miracle that we both get to be here, that the story could have ended so differently if I'd hesitated or second-guessed myself, or let fear and social pressure silence the truth I knew in my bones. I think about that moment at the funeral constantly, about how close we came to losing everything, about how easily I could have stayed silent and let them bury Emma, and lived the rest of my life knowing I'd had a chance to save her and chosen comfort over courage. The experience has changed both of us fundamentally in ways we're still discovering. Emma is more cautious now, but also more appreciative of genuine connections, more able to see red flags in relationships and protect herself without closing herself off to love and trust entirely. I'm more confident in my ability to trust my gut and act on my instincts even when everyone tells me I'm wrong, more willing to speak uncomfortable truths even when it costs me socially. We've both learned that sometimes the truth is terrifying and inconvenient and makes you look crazy, but it's still worth fighting for. Still worth the cost of standing alone if that's what it takes. I'm sharing this story with you today not just because it's dramatic or because it has a happy ending against all odds, but because I want you to understand something crucial about trust and intuition and the importance of listening when someone you love tells you they're worried. Sometimes the people closest to us can see things others miss, patterns and warning signs that are invisible to outsiders but scream danger to those who truly know us. And dismissing those concerns, writing them off as jealousy or paranoia or overprotectiveness, can have fatal consequences. If someone you love and trust tells you they're worried about your safety or your relationship, really listen to them with an open mind and heart. If your instincts are screaming that something is wrong, even when you can't articulate exactly what or why, investigate those feelings instead of pushing them aside for the sake of social harmony or avoiding conflict. And if you ever find yourself in a position like I was in, where you know the truth but everyone thinks you're crazy, where acting on what you know will cost you your reputation and relationships and social standing, I hope my story gives you the courage to act anyway. The criticism, the judgment, the very real possibility of being wrong and humiliating yourself. None of that matters compared to the possibility of saving a life or exposing a dangerous truth. I've been asked so many times if I ever doubted myself in that moment when I stood up at the funeral, if I ever considered just staying quiet and avoiding the scene and maintaining my dignity. And the honest answer is yes. For about half a second, I felt the weight of all those eyes on me and the certainty that I was about to destroy my reputation and possibly my relationship with Emma if I was wrong. But then I thought about Emma trapped in that casket, about losing her forever, about living the rest of my life knowing I'd had a chance to save her and chosen my own comfort over her life. And in that moment, the choice became crystal clear, became the easiest decision I'd ever made, despite being the hardest thing I'd ever done. So here's what I want you to take away from this story. The lessons Emma and I learned through the worst experience of our lives. Trust the people who love you enough to look past your defensive reactions and consider why they're concerned. Trust yourself and your instincts even when they lead you to uncomfortable conclusions. And understand that sometimes the truth is messy and socially awkward and makes you look unstable, but it's still the truth, and it's still worth fighting for with everything you have. Emma and I are living proof that miracles happen, that standing up for what you know to be right can literally save lives, and that the bonds of true love and family can survive even the darkest betrayals and emerge stronger for having been tested. If this story resonated with you, if you've experienced something similar, or if you know someone who needs to hear this message about trusting their instincts and standing up for truth, I want you to do something for me right now. First, leave a comment below telling me what you think. Have you ever had to stand up for someone when no one believed you? Have you ever trusted your instincts against all evidence and advice? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between looking crazy and potentially saving someone? I read every single comment, and your stories might help someone else who's going through something similar, who needs to know they're not alone in facing these impossible choices. Second, and this is really important, if this story made you feel something, if it reminded you why understanding and acting on the truth matters even when it's hard, hit that like button right now. Every like helps this story reach more people who might need to hear it, who might be in their own version of what I went through, who might be ignoring warning signs or dismissing their instincts because it's easier than facing hard truths. Third, subscribe to I Live to Tell for more true stories like this one. Stories about survival and courage and the incredible things ordinary people do when pushed to their absolute limits, when faced with choices between comfort and conscience. We share these stories not for entertainment, but to remind each other of our capacity for bravery, to validate the experiences of people who've lived through trauma, and to provide hope and guidance for those facing their own crises. And don't forget to click that notification bell so you never miss a new story. You never know which one might change your perspective or provide exactly the insight you need at exactly the right moment, or even save a life by teaching someone to trust their instincts. Emma and I are grateful every single day that I listened to the voice inside me that knew the truth, that I was willing to look crazy and stand alone to save her life, and we want this story to inspire others to do the same when faced with their own impossible choices. Thank you for listening to our story. Thank you for being part of this community of survivors and truth tellers. And remember, sometimes the most important thing you can do is trust what you know in your heart to be true, even when the whole world tells you you're wrong, even when the cost feels too high, because some things are worth any price. Until next time, stay safe, trust your instincts, and never underestimate the power of love and determination to overcome even the darkest evil.